So these kinds of organizations didn't want to keep things business as usual. They wanted to bring the people that were at the margins, the people who are pushed to the edge and usually don't have a voice. Um, People like, women who took care of children and never really had, um, childcare issues or, issue of welfare, being very heavily stigmatized and um, trying to flip that around so that you know, family care, um, you resources for single women who are taking care of children, people who depended on welfare could get out of the stigma of of being a burden to society or um, of not contributing to society, and have it be a real, human rights issue, um, and try to flip around a sense of entitlement and who deserves what. You also had the organization Jane, because abortion rights didn't exist in the United States. Abortion was against the law before the Supreme Court case of Roe v. Wade, and because there had been such a long struggle over birth control and women's rights to family planning. Some people, like the people who worked in Jane and other organizations, worked outside of the medical care complex and outside of legal structures to assist women who needed um, abortions or who needed information about family planning or birth control, etc. Um, just like we had talked about birth control being against the law, there were people who still supplied information to women who needed it. Same thing was kind of being done with Jane and this underground abortion referral network that would refer women to practitioners who could perform abortions even though it was against the law. And I wanted to point out something I talked about already, but the idea of people working for gender equality. Um, a reminder that equality doesn't mean men and women or people of different genders getting exactly the same treatment, because of course people are not exactly the same, right? Women have different needs, or people who are able to have children or who menstruate or um, who have certain biological or gender-based needs um, don't shouldn't get the same treatment as people who don't have those needs. That's not what equality is. It means getting what you need in order to have the same opportunities. So people who can have children biologically, right, shouldn't get the same um, exact treatment as people who biologically can't have children or who don't choose to have children. Um, so, for example, like maternity or paternity leave, right? Child care leave. Those those things will have to be different for different people, but they should ensure the same outcome, that people have the right to keep their jobs and not be overlooked for promotions or um, not be punished for having those needs, that they should be able to have the same opportunities to work and have careers and to have the same access to civil and human rights. Well, there was a backlash almost immediately against the women's liberation movement, especially heightened with the Equal Rights Amendment getting, more and more attention. In the 1960s and 70s, as women's liberation movements began to grow, um, especially a conservative, a politically and socially, culturally conservative group of anti-feminists who were women began to speak out. And they found a leader in this woman named Phyllis Schlafly, who spoke out against feminist and women's liberation movements um, as a movement of destruction of the American family, right? That they threatened traditional gendered identities and the gendered spheres, that women should stay home and take care of the children and men should go out and work. And so they saw women's liberation movements as a threat to American tradition. Um, Phyllis Schlafly, ironically though, was a mother and a wife who worked in this movement, speaking at all different kinds of engagements. So it's kind of an interesting case of women anti-feminists. But I think there's a show that's on television called Mrs. America, and I think it focuses on Phyllis Schlafly and this kind of movement. A lot of the women in this movement felt that they were not oppressed in the current system or the contemporary system at that time. And they were concerned that if laws changed, it would be an attack on their security because these women found security in laws that um, or traditions where women were taken care of by men. But also, many of these women found their identity and their meaning in life around these traditional gendered roles. And they felt like their identities were threatened, their economic security was threatened, right? The idea that, okay, so what women are, you know, quote unquote, going to be equal, will they actually get equal treatment? So if the laws change and no longer protect women in terms of, um, I don't know, alimony or child support, etc., but women also won't on the ground really get equal treatment by going to really be considered for different jobs. There was a fear that the safety net of that traditional protection of women would evaporate. So, kind of an interesting um, kind of conflict over uh, what protection of women would really look like. But that whole back and forth between the women's liberation movement and like the anti-women's liberation movement really brought to the forefront the lack of intersectionality. Intersectionality, the term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, I believe in the early 90s, but it's the idea of looking at where class, gender, race, ability, etc., intersect and how that can change your view on a specific issue in ways that others, and especially the mainstream, may not have considered. So there were as these different radical movements began to grow, especially the racial power movements. Um, some of those movements, like specifically the Chicano movement, um, began to and the Black Power movement began to kind of go head to head against these mainstream feminist issues or what's called second wave feminism. First wave feminism was like the feminism like around the right to vote back in the 1920s or the turn of the century. This in this women's liberation movement, this was considered second wave feminism. And after that, as I'll mention in a moment, we have kind of a third wave of feminism. But mainstream feminism, what people think of when they think of a feminist or women's liberation, was very much dominated by white middle class women. That was the face of feminism. The issues that were considered feminist issues were really the issues that were most important to American white middle class women. And since then, it's this kind of feminism that really only looked at issues such as um, access to top corporate positions or access to academia or um, you know uh, identity issues and women being able to be included in things that men had dominated became seen as white feminism. It doesn't mean that white women who are feminists are white feminists or are part of white feminism. White feminism is just a feminism that is very exclusive and doesn't consider those intersections of race, class, privilege, etc. It's like the typical mainstream feminism, um, which was dominated by white women, white middle class women. So it ignored a lot of the issues that non middle class women, non white women faced. And so the resistance to this mainstream feminism or this white feminism began to assert that there are a lot of other issues that other women face that are feminist in nature, but that this mainstream white feminism didn't address. Things like police brutality, poverty, war, immigration, labor organizing. These are women's issues in the sense that they affect women, and within those issues, they affect women differently than they affect men. Right? So, for example, like um, the issue of incarceration, right, is that though men generally get incarcerated in poor communities and communities of color at larger rates than the white community or in comparison to women, women are adversely affected by, incarceration in terms of taking care of children, um, visitors' rights, economic issues. Um, there's like a whole host of issues that were ignored by this mainstream feminism. And so new feminisms began to develop to try to look at the issues that affected women in the most marginalized segments of society. So, like, that mainstream feminism wasn't looking at like how are sex workers being treated? What are issues, gendered issues around homelessness? What are the gendered issues within the lives of undocumented people, or issues surrounding immigration? How did gender affect women um, in terms of like military presence in other countries and war, right? So there's all these issues that were really largely ignored because they weren't seen as women's issues, because women's issues were defined by white middle class women. So then that then prompted this fragmentation of feminism into so many different branches, into racialized feminisms, third world feminism, radical feminism, socialist, liberal, intersectional feminisms, a lot of different, which is good, right? Like looking at different issues with different lenses so that you can address the issues of the largest amount of people that you can. Um, and so a lot of those issues with white feminism actually grew out of conversations and discourses that came from issues within the civil rights movement. So going back even before these radical movements, is that there were Black women in the civil rights movement expressing that women's rights were constantly seen as secondary, and that racial issues, especially those affecting men, were more pressing issues. And even within these power movements, women talked about first we deal with this issue that affects men, and then we'll deal with women's issues afterwards, right? And then when women try to assert issues within the movements themselves, they were then accused of you're undermining the movement. So like in the Black Panthers, when women talked about, well, it's not fair that the women are the ones organizing and doing a lot of the groundwork, but not getting any recognition for it, not being able to speak on behalf of the movement, etc. When they spoke out about those things, they were accused of undermining the movement. Oh, you're fracturing the movement, you're being divisive, as a way to kind of silence. And this happens in a lot of different ways within different movements, is that um, you have a replication of the hierarchy of society, where you have the same groups of people um, that are elevated in society within these marginalized movements. Those people again become the leaders, and there are still voices that get suppressed. And there was a big adherence to traditional gender roles, right? Women cooking the food for the meeting, taking care of children during the meetings, um, doing the kind of grunt work of, walking and flyering and stuff like that, and not being the leaders or not being afforded that opportunity to be leaders in the movement, even though they were doing a lot of the organizing work. An activist from the civil rights movement named Polly Murray wrote a book, or wrote a lot of things, and she wrote one article called Why Negro Girls Stay Single, addressing these issues. And she referred to something called Jane Crow in response to Jim Crow, right? As like looking at those intersections of race and gender, so that there's racial oppression that Black people face, but it's often just seen through the lens of what Black men face. But there are specific things that Black women face that are um, connected but different, and that these were often largely overlooked. And she pointed to the racially determined pattern of manhood that's defined by white manhood in the United States and then gets replicated in other groups that then just recreates gender oppression within the groups. You also saw this within the Chicano movement. You had a Chicana feminist movement, Chicanismo, grow out of the Chicano movement because of the same issues, that women constantly saw themselves as relegated to like the service segment of the organization movement, cooking the food, taking care of the children, not being given access to leadership positions, decision making positions, um, exposure or credit for the work that they did. And so a new movement developed to kind of intersect between the Chicano movement and the women's liberation movement that was connected to a lot of the issues in the Chicano movement, but separate, in order to focus on those kind of intersectionalized issues.